Hello, I'm Kozicki and welcome to the Slippery Slope. We're going to spend some time looking at how people and communities, as well as countries, states, whatever, get into situations that are avoidable. So today we're going to talk about gerrymandering and the global economy. And we're going to spend a little time talking about how those things get connected. So to begin with, if you are paying attention to what's going on in your world, you know that things are changing all the time and the world isn't what it used to be. In fact, when we look at a balanced relationship in life or whatever, there's usually some effort to try to work together and create some predictable patterns, and trying to control relationships in such a way that both sides get something out of it that they can use. When there's an imbalance and one side tends to get more than the other, then we start down that slippery slope. If we look at this next slide that's coming up, many people refer to Adam Smith as the economist or the person that set up what we consider our market economy. But one of the things that Adam Smith had really tried to promote, and maybe it's been lost because of greed or other things, is that we feel much for others as ourselves in a balanced economy. He was the father of behavioral economics, and he really wanted to promote the idea of benevolence, the idea of looking out for one another. Some of that's been lost, and unfortunately that creates a slippery slope. If we look at the next slide, balance is something that we expect our political parties to promote. And some people may be offended by this, but this is fact. I'm not making this up. The Republican Party pays less attention to the poor on economic issues. To do so would otherwise violate the general stance it's taken since the New Deal when Franklin Roosevelt was a president. So they tend to tip the balance in favor of those who are wealthy. If we go to the next slide, we can look at some of the things that have come as a result of this, and in particular the growth of the 1%. The richest 1% now have more wealth than the rest of the world combined, and the wealth of the richest 62 people has risen from 45% to almost $1.6 trillion in a very short time, approximately 5 years in our economy. Meanwhile, the wealth of the bottom half fell by just over $1 trillion in the same period, a 38% drop. Since the turn of the century, the poorest half of the world's population has received just 1% of the total increase in global wealth. So they're a new 1%, a very poor 1%, while half of the increases has gone to the top 1%. And obviously the rest has been distributed between the poorest 1% and the richest 1%. The average annual income to the poorest 10% of people in the world has risen by less than $3 each year in almost a quarter of a century. Their daily income has risen by less than a single cent every year, which is staggering to even consider. We'll look at the next slide. Let me show you a little bit why this happens, and this has to do with gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is something that's been around for a while. Both political parties have been involved with this. The Washington Post has created a video which I think is helpful in explaining the whole process of gerrymandering, and I want you to pay attention to this because this is important. And it's where our political process gets watered down. Because even in fair elections, if you're living in a gerrymandered district, it's like going to the casino and the house is going to win every time. You may have fun voting, but your man's not going to win or your woman's not going to win because the district's gerrymandered. And in many cases, that means your vote doesn't matter. So So it's important for us to consider the idea that something like gerrymandering should not be the way we do politics. In fact, there should be fairness, there should be opportunities for every vote to matter. And we're only going to get that way if we allow people to redistrict. And this can be done using algorithms or creating up commissions that would actually provide a process of creating fair districts. But we have to have more randomness. We have to have more randomness because in districts that are gerrymandered, there's no reason to compromise. There are no reasons to find balance. Those in command or power can push through those things that favor their particular group and at the expense of others. So anyways, this video will help explain how this gerrymandering process affects everybody, including you, in a global economy.
Gerrymandering is? First, let's start with Government 101. In the United States, each state elects a certain number of representatives based on the state's population. The larger your population, the more representatives you have. Each representative represents a district, or a geographical area including its voters. Ideally, we want to have a range of representatives who reflect the political views of the population across the state. But how do we decide who gets to vote for each representative? Let's look at an example. Suppose we have a very tiny state of 50 people. 30 of them belong to the blue party, and 20 belong to the red party. And just our luck, they all live in a nice even grid with blues on one side of the state and reds on the other. Now, let's say we need to divide the state into 5 districts. Each district will send one representative to the House to represent the people. Fortunately, because our citizens live in a neatly ordered grid, it's easy to draw 5 lengthy districts, 2 for the reds and 3 for the blues. Voila! Perfectly proportional representation, just as the founders intended. Now, let's say instead that the blue party controls the state government, and they get to decide how the lines are drawn. Rather than draw districts horizontally, they draw them vertically, so that in each district there are 6 blues and 4 reds. With a comfortable blue majority in the state, each district elects a blue candidate to the House. The blues win 5 seats, and the reds don't get a single one. Oh well, finally, what if the red party controls the state government? The reds know they're at a numerical disadvantage, but with some creative boundary drawing, they can slice the blue population up such that they only get a majority in 2 districts. So despite making up 40% of the population, the reds win 60% of the seats. Not bad. This process of redrawing district lines to give an advantage to one party over another is called gerrymandering, and it's nothing new. The term gerrymander is named after early 19th century Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who redrew the map of the Senate's districts in 1810 in order to weaken the opposing Federalist Party. Our example is of course a huge simplification. In the real world, people don't live in neatly ordered grids sorted by political party. But for politicians looking to give themselves an advantage at redistricting time, the process is exactly the same, and the consequences are very real. Gerrymandering is at least partly to blame for lopsided representation in the House seen in recent elections. And, it's been argued by the President, for political polarization, since representatives don't have to compromise hardline views in order to win seats.
So gerrymandering is something you can tell very easily if you look at a map and you look at a district map and you see squiggles and squirms in all different directions. It's lawmakers trying to bring far-flung voters into a single district, trying to achieve some kind of partisan mix that favors their particular party. And I've said this before, both parties have done this, the Democrats and the Republicans. And it's not fair to the voter, and it leads to these log jams that we have where nothing gets done. If we look at the next slide, you'll see what the current congressional district map is at the top, and you can see below it what a computer-drawn map to optimize compactness would look like. If we go to the next slide, this is what districts should look like in the United States. If we allowed algorithms to pick districts, they would be probably fair, and voters would really have a chance of being involved, and their votes would really matter more. Open, transparent districts would improve upon the status quo, and the boundaries would actually be leading to political process that would favor compromise. If we go to the next slide, here's another thing that's been happening besides the gerrymandering, and it's consumerism. We're all guilty of this. Relatively small rewards can spur action. We're always looking for the cheapest product. We're always looking for the best deal. Sometimes we're not thinking about what that does. The best deal may be putting your neighbor out of work who may be making a product that costs a little bit more. And we've seen that in all of the kinds of manufacturing changes that have taken place throughout the world. If we go to the next slide, and here's what we get. We get a consumption society that really is built on the idea that we have to increase even more consumption in order to keep the economy going. And it's not sustainable. At some point, it's going to break down if it hasn't already. And many of you are already experiencing that. So looking at the next slide, we've had this economic shift. The economy is growing slower now, and almost all the growth has accrued for the top earners. Wages for the 50% bottom workers has not gone up in 40 years. And let me repeat that. Wages for the bottom 50% haven't gone up in 40 years adjusted for inflation. So you can see why it's getting harder for some people to make a living, to stay in the middle class. Most of the decline is driven by a widening gap between the rich and the poor, as opposed to a slowdown in the nation's aggregate economic growth, or the growth of the domestic product. So let's look at the next slide here. Michigan has become part of the fading American dream. Michigan was a top American dream state in the 1970s, ranked 13 among 50 states, with 93% out of earning their parents. So people back in the 70s were making more money and living better than their parents did. Now, if we fast forward to 2010 and where we are now in 2017, Michigan has plummeted to the 48th spot in the nation, only ahead of Alaska and Nevada. Only 46% of the people who are working in the state are faring better than their parents did. The next slide, please. So the fraction of children earning more than their parents has fallen dramatically, from 90% of kids born in the 1940s and 50s to almost 41% now since the 80s. Nearly all men born in 1940 were better off than their fathers, but for those born in 1984 and later, the rate has dropped to about 41%. For daughters, the rate went from 43% to 26%, which shows that they're still not making as much as men, despite what people talk about. So if we look at the next slide, and we look at how Michigan economy is now, the median hourly wage in Michigan is lower today at about $17.32 than it was 10 years ago when it was $18.67. Michigan is only one of only 8 states where residents have lost economic ground since 2007. So looking at the next slide here, here's a very good example of that. The Kozicki family. Brian Kozicki in 1977 walked out of a high school and into a Ypsilanti factory. By 19, the General Motors employee was making about $26 an hour, had enough money to buy a house. His son, in 2012, Kyle Kozicki, walked out of high school and onto a campus at Central Michigan University. 5 years later, armed with a bachelor's degree, he earned $16 an hour as a reporter, the equivalent of 60% of what his father made straight out of high school. Those are the new realities today. Looking at the next slide, how has politics affected this? Well, in a number of different ways. And we can see this in the most recent election. When President Trump won Michigan by the narrowest margin in this last November's election, receiving 10,000 more votes than Democrat Hillary Clinton out of 4.8 million votes that were cast. The Republicans swept the state congressional district, capturing 9 of the 14 state seats. And they did this through gerrymandering, tipping the scale in favor of their party because of redistricting. If we go to the next slide, we can see that the result is that many people have expectations that Trump and the Republican Party are going to bring jobs back from other places, China, Mexico, or whatever, because those are the promises that they made. We have to be realistic here. And more importantly, we have to understand that gerrymandered districts most likely are going to favor the wealthy. They're not going to favor the middle class, which have been losing out for over 40 years. If we look at the next slide, here's some takeaways then that we have to keep in mind. Gerrymandering creates an imbalance in representation that tends to favor the wealthy. The shift to low-wage states and countries has eroded the number of work opportunities that created the middle class. And that shift is permanent. It's not going to change. We're not going to see those high-paying jobs come back, because if they do come back, they're going to come back in automated plants, and there's not going to be very many people that'll be hired. Loss of personal purchasing power has been offset by available cheap products from low-paying countries. And so the Walmarts and the Kmarts and all these places have been supplying people with essentially cheap products for a long time. So there's been some offset, but at the expense of a middle class, at the expense of a job. The downward spiral that we're experiencing now towards a diminished quality of life will only come about and change when there's a balance in the political process that considers shared wealth and a compromise on important social issues. And so gerrymandering is actually feeding into this continuation of a downward spiral. And until we balance those districts again and force political processes to consider both sides of the equation, things aren't going to change. So if we look at the future here, and we move to the next slide here, I want you to know that these are facts. This is not fake news or fake stories I'm giving you. Here are the references that I'm using as opposed to making this stuff up. So thank you for listening to this program, and I want you to consider that we're all on a slippery slope, and that things can go off balance very quickly if we don't pay attention. And it's up to you and I to change the balance and to stay off that slippery slope. Thank you very much.